it's a very interesting moment today. I had conversations about fiber in the US. Me and and our teams that we would have never had 15 years ago. So things are moving fast.
Hello, everyone. I'm Laura Greiner, your host for today's Swine podcast. And with me today, I have Dr. Marc Decoux, who is the Senior Technical Lead for Swine Nutrition at Cargill Animal Nutrition. How are you today, Marc?
Very good, Laura. Thanks. Very good. How about you?
I'm doing very well. Well, before we get started with our conversation, I'm going to have you do a little bit more of an introduction about yourself. So I'll let you give the more formal background about who you are.
All right. So I have been working in animal nutrition for about 25 years, and my background is agronomy engineering, and then after a Master of Science at Agro Paris, which is a French education school, I specialized in animal nutrition, and then I've been working in that area all my career in different species, but most of it has been swine. And I worked in different positions that could be research management, it could be technical support to producers, or even marketing and sales. So it's been it's quite a very interesting journey over the last 25 years.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Well, and I think it's good too to talk a little bit about the position you have today. As we were visiting, you talked about the fact that you work not only with the European producers, but you're also working with the United States producers and having some very interesting conversations, particularly about the differences in nutrition between the two countries. And it's something that we've all recognized for years in terms of how we feed our pigs, and even the ingredients that we have available are definitely different. But the area that I really want to talk about today is focuses around sows and fiber, and the information we know in Europe versus the US, and how do we bridge that gap. So I'm going to kind of start out with just the simple, can you communicate to us what you're seeing in terms of the differences between fiber use in Europe and what's being used today in America?
Yes, it's definitely the first things that comes to mind when we compare the two different types of nutrition, and we do this a lot in Cargill. We have a lot of discussions about what is being used in different parts of the world. What can we learn from the different systems? So I would say fiber and the different fractions of fibers in Europe are considered today as important in terms of nutrients as amino acids or energy. So they are considered very highly in formulation, in formula specifications. And if you think in terms, let's start with a simple way of describing fiber, NDF, let's say, you're going to have very often NDF levels very high, but 22% in some formulas, even higher than this. You're going to have minimums of fiber inclusions, including on certain ingredients, both in gestation feed and lactation feed. And also related to this, because of this high use of fiber, very often the formulas will have a nutrient density and an energy density that is quite lower than what we could see in the United States. And so, where in the United States you might see from times to times, beside of corn, soy, and distillers, you might see wheat middlings, and you're going to see a lot more diversity of fiber and also a grain that is particularly used in Europe. It's really a staple of South formulation, which is barley. It's it's used almost everywhere. It's so there is a big difference here indeed. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So when you start talking to producers in the United States, what are some of their primary questions that they come up with, and how to take the information from Europe and all of the knowledge that you all have generated in your research and put it into our barns here?
So one question is from US producers is what fiber sources they could use, because most of the European experience and publications are with fiber sources that are not easy to find in the US or that can be very expensive. And this cost might offset the benefits you would have with fiber. If you take, for example, barley or beet pulp, they are not as easily available as what you would have in Europe. And another question is how to formulate with fiber. What type of nutrients should we use in formulation? Um, we first started to think that a constraint on NDF would be enough, but we know that it's not enough. We know that, for instance, corn distillers are very high in NDF, or you could have also very indigestible fiber, very high in NDF, and it's not going to be enough to provide all the benefits we need in fiber. So we have to use more sophisticated criterias. And today we have work on soluble versus insoluble fiber. We are also talking about fermentable fiber against structural fibers. And so we have these conversations about how to take that into account in formulation. Because if we have a precise way to describe fiber by their properties in formulation, that gives us more flexibility. So we are not relying only on one ingredient, but we can be a little bit more flexible.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's probably one of the biggest confusions I hear a lot is just, well, what's the difference between insoluble, insoluble, and fermentable? And, we're talking NDF one minute and then we're talking a different form the next. And I think that's where, as nutritionists, it becomes frustrating because it's easy to say this is the lysine level of an ingredient
Yes.
and this is where we're at. And obviously, different phases of production have different fiber needs too. And so, how do you maybe break that down into simple terms for those that are maybe struggling with that?
So it's a very interesting question, and we do believe that we need at least to separate the fiber in two groups. One is going to be fiber that are actually fermented by the microbiota in the cells, and they are going to be turned into different nutrients, so especially volatile fatty acids. And when this is happening, there is different types of effects on the microbiota. There is also a supply of a certain type of energy, and it's going to have an impact on cell health and also on their behavior, because it's going to change also how the energy is absorbed by the cells. And then there is another group that are fibers that are sometimes called inert fiber, that are not transformed into anything. They just come out in a manure as they are. So they would have more structure mechanical effect. Also, over time, we've realized that they have a much bigger diversity of effects. And this type of fiber, they're going to have different effects on cell transit, intestinal transit. They're going to have effect on cell behavior as well. And they have effect also on the microbiota. We think that could be because they are used as a support by the microbiota. So the microbiota can grow on it, using it as a physical structure. But that could be also they have effect on enzymes, and it's quite difficult to understand because they are supposedly inert, but actually they are much more active than we thought, and there is a more and more interest also on these type of fibers. And so typically when we move from only looking at NDF to these two types of fiber in formulation, we're going to see more consistent results on the cells themselves. So that really shows that you have these two different parts to control in formulation.
Mm-hmm. Is it a ratio between the two, so fermentable versus inert, or is it no, we need to have a minimum of this amount of fermentable and a minimum of this amount of inert?
Yeah, it's also a very interesting question, because very usually in most of the feedstuff we're using, the two fractions are present, unless we're using very purified type of fibers. And so I don't know what would be the ratio, but we need a balance for sure. So if we only have purely fermentable fiber, we may have a certain number of issues, like bloating, for instance. If we have a lack of structural fiber, we might also have issues because of transits, for instance. But if we only have structural fiber, we may also see a change in cell behavior, and they're going to have a different way of behaving during the day, also with hunger, and especially when we get close to parturition, it's clear that we need both types. The ratio is not that easy to describe, but we do have specifications for the two types of fiber, and it's a range of values basically. And I couldn't say it's a one-to-one ratio, for instance, but you need both, and it has to be balanced. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned that we see changes in behavior if we use the inert versus the fermentable. What type of changes do you see?
So if it's going also to depend on over things, like for instance, when we speak about structural fiber, the particle size is going to have an effect, and or how many times a day the cells are fed. But we see that when using fermentable fiber, typically what happens is there is a more steady level of glucose in the blood along the day, because this is what we could call a slow energy type. And so sows are going to have a more stable behavior, and they won't have these high and lows of sugars in the blood, and they will not be so nervous, for instance, after a couple of hours, because they start to feel hunger. But on the other side, if we are using a certain type of structural fiber, that can swell with water, and that can also affect gastric emptying. So we might also slow down the gastric emptying, and that can also help to slow down the energy release. However, at some point you really have a lack of glucose, and so sows are going to start feeling hunger again. So it's clear that only providing, for instance, purely inert fiber without having some fermentation might have an effect on sows that could be negative. Another thing I would think might be due to the microbiota itself. So the microbiota needs some nutrients. So structural fiber will help, but they need some nutrients to grow. And that's not having that kind of microbiota growing have an effect probably on, for instance, the intestinal efficiency.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think you bring up some really good points. I can remember not that long ago being at a conference with Dr. Peter Thiel talking, and I remember he showed a beautiful slide on fiber. And in fact, I used that slide in some of my conversations about how it can, in fact, reduce parturition time and improve, stillborn percentages and so forth. And so I think that's an excellent point about constant sugar or glucose being available to the sow, particularly since we restrict feed or control feed her regularly.
It's true. I mean, I agree. Around parturition, for instance, it's well known, and we can see that in farms where farmers are adding on top of the standard feed pure beet pulp, for instance. Sometimes it's half and half when they feel that the sows are going to need that type of slow energy to overcome the parturition at night, for instance. So we've seen this type of practices in farms for many years, and the question is, how can we scale this up and have it included in complete diet, so we don't have this manual work to do for helping the sows. Yeah.
Right. So how long before parturition would they start adding the beet pulp to the rations?
So typically it's going to be 2 to 3 days. So that's the time needed for fiber to reach the hindgut and start being more fermented. And of course, they don't exactly know when the sows are going to give birth. So it's a rule of thumb, but it's roughly that, 2 to 3 days before parturition. Yeah, and that can be also in the early lactation as well, when that's another discovery around fiber, how they can help also in early lactation, for other reasons. But it's we've seen that too. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's interesting. Years ago, even here in the US, I can remember reading a paper from Dr. Gretchen Hill where we talked about different fibrous products and how it improves milk production. And again, we understand, right? I don't think there's a lack of understanding in the United States that there's value, but you kind of hit the nail on the head early on, was the investment and the return. And some of the things that you're communicating, like a change in behavior, isn't necessarily economically measurable, right? So how do we help producers kind of understand where those economics lie, right? Milk production, we have to weigh the pigs to see that, which in time we'll notice. But can you kind of help me walk through how you help producers understand the investment and the return?
It's it's interesting, and that puts me sometimes in a weird situation, because I'm talking about the experience from Europe. And the questions we have is, okay, where is the data? Show us the data, show us the return on investment. And if I go back to the European producers, for them that's an old story. They don't want to go back to this. They think, okay, we've seen it works and that's what we do, but we don't want to spend time in trying that again. And in fact, I think there is a lot of progress to expect from the US swine industry and science on fiber. One particularity of Europe is that fiber sources are easily available, they are cheap, while corn and soy are pretty expensive. That's linked to a lot of different things. The swine production areas are close to harbor, or they are close to food industries. So there is plenty of fiber available. And so economically, it's never such a big problem to start using fiber. And another difference, of course, there are differences between countries in Europe, but most of the farms are family farms. They are also large integrators, of course, but a lot of the work on fiber could be done partly by science, partly by really trials and errors by the farmers themselves. So they with a farmer having a 500 or 1,000 sows farm, they learn a lot, and there is these constant discussions with nutritionists, and they can taking a risk or taking a decision on fiber formulation in a 1,000 sow farm is not the same as a 100,000 sow unit, so, or a system. So back to your question, I think that is a very healthy discussion, and that is also forcing us to look back at this and try to understand really what are the benefits. There is different types of benefits, I think. The first one is going to be on health. So anything that today is causing involuntary culling of sows because of prolapses, because of lameness, or because of injuries, can usually be related to even returns or long weaning to estrus intervals. They are usually effects that we can relate to fiber. And MMAs also, we've seen some relations. So when we start working on fibers, one of the first things I would look at are the health parameters of the sow herds, and see how we can reduce cullings around that. A second point, of course, is going to be on the litters themselves. So you were mentioning parturitions, and there is a lot of work today on how using a high amount of certain fibers around parturition is going to improve the survival rates of piglets. But recent publications also shown an effect on the average daily gain of the litters, and you could even think of the health of the piglets themselves. And the more we know about the microbiota of the sows and of the offsprings, the more we see how fiber is influencing it towards the microbiota that we know is in favor of pig health and growth. And that will turn at the end into more kilo of meat per sow per year. What I was saying is about where I'm very excited is that the US pork industry has the capacity, because of the very large size units there is, to actually have the data that can prove this on a large scale, while it would be harder to redo this type of trials in Europe on large scale systems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. There's no doubt you can get data very quickly here in the United States
Yeah.
and have some very valuable information. And performance-wise, we have some very nice performing herds as well that I think would somewhat equate over to what's happening in Europe as well. One of the things that kept kind of popping into my mind if I was sitting here and thinking as a producer is, okay, I'm sold, right? Fiber is great. Let's add it. What would be some current fiber sources in the United States that you would recommend? I mean, and we know we have distillers and we know that's not really the type of fiber we're chasing. So you'd also mentioned wheat mids, but in your time with Cargill and working back and forth, what are some more common fiber sources that you feel we have access to?
Yep. Well, soybean hulls are really an interesting one in combination with middlings, because they are, in our view, very rich in fermentable fiber. So they can be very interesting to balance this supply of structural and fermentable fiber when combined with middlings or even distillers. And so that would be really where to start, I think. And then depending on the states, and because there are going to be different type of food industries, different type of suppliers available, it might be possible to find certain types of fiber. It's not going to be okay for the entire US territory, but in certain states, you might see some interesting fibers, even beet pulp in some case. However, with soybean hulls and with middlings, there is already a lot to do, I think, and even in lactating sows.
What kind of percent are we talking about if we think of an inclusion level in the diet? I know we didn't really get into numbers for fermentable versus insoluble, but what kind of percent inclusion are you thinking we might need to use?
So it can be extremely high. We've seen, for instance, systems where we want to work with ad libitum fed sows, for instance, rearing gilts, and we want to be sure that their voluntary intake is under control, that they are not overeating. And we can have formulas with 30-40% of soybean hulls. And on the other side, it's very common in our types of formulations, at least, to see 5 to 10% of soybean hulls, even in lactating sows, which of course raises the question of how do I fulfill my requirements in net energy, because I'm adding all this fiber and that might dilute the feed, and so I need to add more fat, which is quite expensive. So there is also, of course, always coming up at some point the question of net energy and how do we value these fiber sources in net energy to be sure we are not overspending money on that. Yeah.
Right. That was my next question: was how much energy credit are you giving
Yeah.
some of our fermentable fibers? Are they getting a different value than maybe what we've seen in the past?
Yes, and I wouldn't be able by head to tell you a relative value against corn, but it's definitely higher in sows than in growth finisher pigs. So in the nutrition system we're using, we have different net energy values for different production phase. And very typically in gestation and lactating sows, fiber values are going to be way more interesting in terms of net energy than in grower pigs, and even more than in piglets. And that's that is every company would have their own systems, but I would say it's also a common thing of what we've seen in Europe. Most of the formulation systems today have at least two systems, so one for sow and one for grower pigs. And that's what's helping also to formulate with high fiber diets. And we've seen that if we use the net energy value for grower pigs in high fiber sow diets, we're going to see some signals that sows are overfed with energy. So they might get more fat than what we expect, and that really tells something. We are it's quite a common practice, I would say, to have these very specific net energy values for fiber sources for sows, and it works pretty well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's really kind of one of those points to bring home is that we don't do that here in the United States. And when we are running those diets and we're practicing those formulas to decide if it's cost effective, we are typically using grow finish numbers. I'm not saying everybody does, right? But a large number would probably do that because it's convenient. And we probably are leaving some money on the table because we're not giving it the appropriate credit. So I do appreciate that comment. The other thing that I heard you say, and we'll talk about this briefly, is the developing gilt. So you mentioned in here that you're using fiber for developing gilts to hold gilts, right? So that they don't get too overweight. But is there any other benefit to feeding fiber during gilt development that you've noted?
Yeah. There have been publications showing that it also increased their reproductive performance. I don't know. I mean, there are discussions around this, but it could be related to their insulin metabolism. Again, we spoke about glucose in relation to reproductive hormones, but there are publications showing that increasing the supply of a certain type of fiber in developing gilts will improve their fertility rate and their estrus in the first mating. There have been also studies about how it helps to grow their intake capacity when it's going to be an issue, for instance. So that would be more valid for their first gestation and how it can help them to increase their intake capacity in lactation. It could be because with bulky intake, with the intake of a bulky type of feed, it's going to grow their stomach capacity. Pigs are very good at doing this. Or it could be, again, because of volatile fatty acids produced out of fermentation, and that's going to make the digestive system more efficient. So, but it's definitely used in developing gilts, and because very few farmers are actually capable of restricting these gilts. And with the type of genetics there is today, which are fast-growing genetics, it's very hard to keep them in check. They are using these strategies to try to control their ad libitum intake.
Perfect. Well, we're kind of wrapping up on our time, Marc. Are there any key points that you would like our audience to take home with them today?
Yes, I think it's a very interesting moment today. I had conversations about fiber in the US, me and our teams that we would have never had 15 years ago. So things are moving fast, and I'm very hopeful because, as I was saying before, I think the US pork industry has the capacity to produce an amount and a quality of data on this that was not possible elsewhere, and that's going to help not only the swine industry but everyone to get better at using fiber. So there is a lot of interest on this, and and so that's worth working on it and producing the data that we need, and that's what we are working on also at Cargill to help producers taking decisions. And another thing is to indeed always consider the importance of the formulation system, because that's very important to provide this flexibility that producers need to use fiber. It's very hard to be effective and flexible enough to use fiber if the formulation system is not accounting properly for the properties of this fiber, but also for the net energy that they are providing to the pigs. And I think we will keep discovering new benefits of fiber, especially with the data that I know is now being produced out of the US systems.
Mm-hmm. Perfect.
It is time to our famous three.
Well, one of the things we like to ask before we let you go is really a couple of questions we ask all of our guest speakers. The first one would be, what swine resource do you recommend to our listeners?
So it's one particular resource I was reading recently, which is not exactly related to fiber, but somehow it's about it's actually a report that was produced by a group of international researchers um, on summarizing the knowledge today there is on health and nutrition. It was published by the FAO in 2021. And there is really a broad group of persons who participated to that. And fiber is actually one of the key nutrients they are talking about. And what was quite interesting too is that typically when we speak about fiber, health, and nutrition, we think about piglets. But there is a whole chapter in this in this paper on sows as well, and especially transition sows around parturition, and how when it comes to improving the health of the animals while having a responsible use of antibiotics, actually the work's being done around fiber and health in transition sows around parturition is also a very good way to work on this. So that was quite interesting for me to see that so well articulated in the paper.
Yeah, I'll have to definitely, I missed that paper, so I'll have to look at that one and read that section specifically. How about something that's not related to pigs? Is there a book you're currently reading?
Yes, actually, I'm reading it for a second time because I read it about 4 years ago, and it's Why Simple Wins from Lisa Bodel. And I think it's so important for me to read this type of books because it reminds us that whatever we do, we need to really be careful about not making things more complex than they are. And I think fiber is a very good topic on that sense. And so especially as scientists, we like complexity. We thrive on complexity, and the hardest thing is to make it simple and usable. So it's always a good reminder for me not to get ahead of myself and remember that things can be simpler than they are.
Absolutely. That's very good. Very good point right there. So how about the last question we have is, if you can think about somebody in your life that you define as successful, what would be a key trait that they possess that you think's allowed them to be successful?
I think I have several persons in mind, and one of them has been my first mentor in my professional life. It's being very open and curious about human knowledge, and this capacity that especially I'm thinking about one person that person had to be really exploring knowledge and very curious about why people are doing things differently than I do and what can I learn from them. And I think in swine nutrition, it's very interesting to apply this concept, and especially when we are discussing about the differences of approach between Europe and the US. But even if you are in Europe, you wouldn't see the same approach within European countries. There is a lot of differences and a lot of discussions between European nutritionists on things where they don't agree between them for sure. And so every time you see these differences of experience and opinions, this is where curiosity is triggered, and you want to understand why there is this difference and what can we learn from it. And I've been very excited by this type of approach and very inspired by this person. And I think today I see this more and more in swine nutrition, this openness from anywhere in the world to really look at what the others are doing and try to see how can we do this ourselves, or what can we learn from it. It's and that's the same for the Europeans. They can learn also from the US market. We've seen that many times.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree. It's amazing the conversations we can have as well. We might all be competitors, even within our own countries. There's a lot of information we're willing to share, and it's to advance our understanding and improve, what we're doing today. So I would agree. And I've heard curiosity a couple of times now, actually, from some of our guest speakers. So that seems to be one that stands out the most for some of our people to be successful is curiosity. So definitely thank you for sharing that one. Our time today is kind of come to an end. It's been a wonderful conversation. I've enjoyed visiting with you. For our audience, again, if you missed the beginning, this is Dr. Marc Decoux, and he is with Cargill Animal Nutrition. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Laura.
Imagine if, with a few key concepts, you could have the potential to create a massive positive impact by bringing from hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars for swine producers. Join us on this small group and go to the next level of swine nutrition on this 7-week-long elite online training in applied swine nutrition and feeding by myself and my world-class invited speakers. Additionally, you enjoy an exclusive community to exchange ideas. Go now to www.eliteswinenutritionist.com.